Tonight we are in John chapter 14, and we're going to be in verses 1 through 3 tonight as we start this new devotional on the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to share with you, I was talking just a few moments ago and mentioned to you about how this devotional has no specific references to the book of Revelation, which is kind of hard for us to believe considering we're studying the book of Revelation right now, and we just finished the glorious appearing, the second coming of Christ. And so for us, we would think, well, there's got to be some reference to the book of Revelation, but there's not. And that's an interesting thing for us to hold on to. And I'm going to read to you some information. It's kind of like statistics if you want to look at it from that regard, but this is information about the second coming of Jesus Christ in the Bible, not just the New Testament, but in the Old and the New Testament. And this is how this article reads. It says, biblical prophecy provides some of the greatest encouragement and hope available to us today. Just as the Old Testament is saturated with prophecies concerning Christ's first advent or his first coming, so both testaments are filled with references to the second coming of Christ. One scholar has estimated that there are 1,845 references to Christ's second coming in the Old Testament. Nearly 1,900 in the Old Testament alone, okay? And it says also this is where 17 books give it prominence. 17 books out of the Old Testament. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. But it also says that in the 260 chapters of the New Testament, okay, 260 chapters, there are 318 references to the second advent or the second coming of Christ. Now think about that. There's 260 chapters, but 318 references. That's more than one per chapter, so to speak. Now granted, not every chapter speaks about it, but there's that many. And here is an amazing fact. 1 out of every 30 verses in the New Testament talk about the second coming of Christ. Pretty popular subject, it sounds like. But then, as it says here, 23 of the 27 New Testament books refer to this great event. There's only 4 books of the Bible in the New Testament that do not refer or do not mention the second coming of Christ. I could probably take a quick guess that one is probably Philemon. Probably another would probably be it wouldn't even be the book of Jude. I bet Jude has it. So it would be interesting to know what those 4 books are. But nevertheless, we know it's not the Gospels. We know it isn't several of the books of the epistles of Paul. But nevertheless, there are 4 books there that do not refer to it. But for every prophecy in the Bible that concerns the first coming of Jesus, the Nativity, there are 8 that look forward to the second. So for every prophecy in the Bible that talks about Jesus' first coming, there are 8 that speak about his second coming. And so, as important as the first advent of Christ, the first coming of Christ, the Nativity as we would call it, as important as that is to the salvation of mankind, how much greater in importance is the second coming? And it may have to do with the fact of, and there's probably a lot of reasons for it, but one reason might be one of the things that we've talked about in our Revelation study, and that is that the more people there will be on the earth at that time, at the second coming of Christ, during the tribulation and during this time frame, means that we need to give it a greater prominence in our lives, that it ought to constantly captivate us, that it ought to be at the forefront of our mind so as to keep us on task doing what we need to be doing as Christians, sharing the gospel, which is ironically the topic of Sunday's message. And so these are some really important statistics that sort of help frame our view about the second coming. And so that is why when I read through the devotional and saw that there was no reference to the book of Revelation in it, I got to realizing and reading this article, I thought, well, no wonder. There's plenty to work off of, not just the book of Revelation when it comes to the second coming of Christ. But Jesus' second coming is one of the most encouraging truths in the Bible. It's one of those that can encourage us in those times when we are persecuted, like the church in China. Their only hope at this point is God, is Christ alone, so to speak. Their only hope at this point is that Christ will sustain them, that he will encourage them, and if he sees fit, he returns and raptures the church out of not only China but the rest of the world. Jesus came to earth the first time, as we read about in Luke chapter 2 and in Matthew chapter 1. We read about how Jesus came as just a common baby born in Bethlehem. There was nothing special about it. If nothing else, it was probably as common a birth as could have been found in those days. And so there wasn't anything out of the way about it, but he lived a perfect life. He died for the sins of everyone. He was buried, and then after 3 days, he was raised from the dead by the power of God. And that is the gospel message. That is why Jesus came. That's why he came the first time. And as we know from our study that Jesus' second coming is going to be, as when we look at the rapture, it is to pull the church out. But his true second coming to earth is the glorious appearing. At the end of the tribulation, he comes, he defeats the Antichrist and the false prophet. Satan is bound and thrown into a prison, basically, for 1,000 years. And then after that, he's released, and Jesus takes care of business, so to speak. That's the Reader's Digest version of chapter 20 and 21 in Revelation. But nevertheless, just as Jesus foretold his own death and resurrection, he also proclaimed that one day he was going to come back. He tells us about it in the Gospels. It's a focus of those 20, it's mentioned 23 times in 27 books in the New Testament. And so that ought to tell us that it is very important, that it ought to be prominent not only in the biblical text, but prominent in our lives, in our minds, that we are constantly keeping that at the forefront, and that it shapes what we do as believers. And so tonight we're going to look at John 14, verses 1 through 3. And we're going to see, first and foremost, that Jesus Christ will return to earth. Okay? So let's read verses 1 through 3 and look at what he tells us. It says, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." So right here, we read a very popular verse or set of scriptures that talks about the return of Christ. And this is one that we cling to, one that we hold to. That, he tells us that that we shouldn't be troubled, even when we face persecution to the extent that the Chinese church is. When we face those persecutions, when we have health problems, when we have difficulties in life, he tells us, let not your heart be troubled. He doesn't put any stipulations on that. He doesn't put any restrictions or requirements on that. Let not your heart be troubled over anything, okay? Don't be bothered. Don't be troubled. Don't be worried. And he says, because if you believe in God, believe also in me. And so we do. We believe in him. That is the core tenet of our understanding of the gospel, is belief in Jesus Christ. And I'm telling you, I promise you, I could not have orchestrated the way the Lord has worked tonight's devotion, Sunday morning's message, and Sunday night's message. I wish I was smart enough to have orchestrated it and pulled it all together. But because generally you guys are here Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, and you guys are going to see this. The things that we're talking about tonight are going to overlay into Sunday morning and overlay into Sunday night. And it's awesome. I just love to see when the Lord pulls things together like that, when I'm obedient to follow the direction that he has for us. But what we see here is, he's telling us that if we have belief in him, then he's going to go do something. He's gone somewhere to do something for us if we believe in him. He says, in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. Jesus would have told us because he is truth. If it wasn't true, he wouldn't tell us that. He wouldn't tell us that he's gone he's gone to heaven to build us a place to live. He wouldn't tell us that if it wasn't true. And so he says, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself. So he's saying, if I'm going to go and put the effort into building this place for those that believe in me, if I am going to build this place, then I'm going to come back and get you and take you with me and receive you to myself. And that's a foreshadowing to the rapture, as we understand from our study of Revelation. He's talking about receiving us to him. And so we're either going to be raptured out, or we're going to die and he's going to receive us to himself. And so that's our understanding of what he's talking about here, because that is the two instances under which, or the two cases in which we will go to heaven. Either this earthly body will give out on us, and we will take our last breath here on earth and our first breath in heaven and be in the presence of the Lord, or he's going to return and rapture us out. Either way, it's basically going to be instantaneous, and we're going to be in the presence of the Lord. We're not going to know one moment from the next what exactly happens. All of a sudden we're going to be in the presence of the Lord, and that's all that's going to matter. And all of the struggles, all of the trials, all the tribulations of this life are going to be well worth it when we stand before him and we're in his presence. And so he tells us, I'm going to receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. We get to go to heaven with him. He's in heaven. We're told in the book of Acts, he ascends to the Father and is sat down at the right hand of the Father. So we get to go to heaven and be in the presence of our Lord. And so that's very powerful when we look at that. That Jesus tells us right here in John 14, verses 1 through 3. He tells us very clearly, very plainly, when we look at it and we understand this in the context of the other scriptures that we have studied, not only in our Revelation study, but other scriptures that we have read and studied throughout our lives, we see that he's telling us right here that we shouldn't be worried about it. We shouldn't let the things of this world weigh us down, because we believe in him. And since we believe in him, he's going to make us a place. And since he's went to go make us a place, he's going to come back and get us and take us to that place. And if he hadn't went to that place and hadn't gone to prepare this place, he wouldn't have told us that he had done so. But since he has done that, he's going to come and get us and take us to where he is so we can be with him. And that's what he tells us, in these few verses. And what we ought to pull from that in regards to the study that we're going through right here is that he's promising us, not just here, but throughout other parts of the scriptures, he's promising that he's going to return. Now, one of the things that people will a lot of times say is, why has it been 2,000 years? Why has it been so long? And one thing that we can rely on is the truth of the scriptures, in the regard that, the Bible tells us that 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is 1,000 years in the presence of the Lord. And so what that means for us is that, simply put, it's been like 2 days since Jesus left. I don't want him to rush on the house he's making for me. I don't want to rush him to get that mansion done. He might leave the plumbing out early. You get the gist. But the thing about it is, we see that even though God created time for us, creation, when he created light, that's when time began. Okay? Prior to that, there was no concept of time. There was no time because it was just God. And so God spoke. He created the light, created everything over the 6 days, and then rested. But at the point that creation began, time began. But see, God lived outside of time before that. And where God is in the spiritual realm, there is no concept of time. And so for us, we understand that to Jesus, it's just been a day or two. It's like it's only been a day or two. And so for him, he's not pressured to get back to us, so to speak. Does that mean it's going to be another 1,000 or 2,000 years before Christ returns? I don't know. I'm smart enough to know, having already read next week's devotional, only God the Father knows when Christ will return. I've read enough of the scriptures to know that it doesn't do us any good to speculate and set dates and do things like that, because only God knows when Jesus will come back. And so for us, though, we understand that he is coming back. That is the thing we have to hang our hat on, is that we know with 100% certainty that it is unequivocally true that he will return. That's the only thing that we have to worry about. The promises that God has made, he's always fulfilled. And so just because there are promises that have yet to be fulfilled doesn't mean that he's been proven wrong. Doesn't mean that he's not going to fulfill them. It just means that in his in His infinite wisdom and in His plan, it's not time to send Jesus back yet for the rapture, much less 7 years later for the glorious appearing. And so God, not being one to be impatient when it comes to His interaction with mankind, what we see is that He is long-suffering. He is patient because He doesn't want anyone to perish. Ain't that what the Scriptures tell us? And so He is very patient with us. He's patient with us on an individual level, but He's also patient with us as the whole of humanity, in the regard that He is very patient and willing to wait on us in large groups to put our faith in Him. And so tonight I wanted to share with you a story. This is from the 1780s, okay? This is 240 years ago, almost to the day. And what is happening that I'm going to read about occurred in Hartford, Connecticut, where the House of the Representatives of the I guess, soon-to-be state of Connecticut, or the colony of Connecticut at the time, they were in the building for the House of Representatives. It says on May 19th, 1780, the sky over Hartford, Connecticut darkened ominously, and some of the representatives, glancing out the windows, feared that the end was at hand. They thought it was the end of time. Quelling a clamor for immediate adjournment, they thought time was up and they were wanting to go home, basically. Colonel Davenport, the Speaker of the Connecticut House of Representatives, rose and said, "The day of judgment is either approaching or it is not. If it is not, there is no cause for adjournment. If it is, I choose to be found doing my duty. Therefore, I wish that candles be brought." Evidently, this was some bad storm or some volcanic eruption somewhere else on the earth had caused the sky over New England to darken. And I have read other accounts about this same time about that happening. But it says, rather than fearing what is to come, we are to be faithful till Christ returns. And that's what I'm going to be found faithful doing what I'm supposed to be doing until Christ returns. That's basically what Colonel Davenport was saying there. But that ought to be our perspective. That ought to be our mantra. That I'm going to be faithful doing what Christ has called me to do until the moment He splits open the sky and steps out and raptures the church. That ought to be our goal. That ought to be what we find ourselves wanting to do. Jesus tells us in that scripture, He says that we as His followers are not to be troubled, that we're not to be worried. We're not to worry when the sky gets dark. We're not supposed to be worried about the things of this earth or this world. Because if we're a follower of Christ, then we can be hopeful because we know that Jesus is preparing that eternal place for us. That He is preparing that home for us in heaven. And so if He is there preparing it, He's going to come back and retrieve us, so to speak, or get us. This promise that He makes to us, that He's going to come back for us, can make our current problems more bearable. See, as I said earlier, that's the hope for the church in China, is that, even though some are going to these re-engineering or whatever it is, camps where they are re-education camps or centers. Even though some are trying to be brainwashed or are being brainwashed by the government, even though they're losing their Bibles, their crosses, their churches, people are being imprisoned and arrested, and probably, I'm sure there are plenty being murdered, and it just isn't in the news or we just don't hear about it. But even though all of that's happening, even though their faith is being tested, and even though they're being forced to give up on or people are trying to force them to give up on their religion, what we see is that this promise that Jesus is coming back for us makes our problems, whether they're that difficult or it's something altogether different in our own life, it makes those difficult times all the more bearable because we know He's coming back for us. He's either coming back for us when this life is over or He's going to rapture the church out. And as I said earlier, either one of those could happen. Either one of those could happen this evening. But the thing we have to do is we have to remember that when He does come back, or let me rephrase that, that during our times of trouble, during our times of difficulty now, we can trust in the fact that He is coming back. And that is the light at the end of the tunnel for us. That we can trust in that we can believe in that, and that we can have hope for this life and hope for eternity simply because He is returning for us. And so that's the end of our devotional tonight.